Girls Development Center. I've had the pleasure of working with the Commissioner on the key issue of the timely reauthorization of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which passed in June of 2015. Commissioner Assil also participated in a forum my office held on the margins of the 2015 landmark U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. Today, Madam Commissioner is here representing the African Union Commission Chairperson, Her Excellency Dr. Zuma, and will address the current and future role of the African Union. Please join me in welcoming Madam Commissioner Assil. Thank you. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. Excuse me. Oops. Hello, can everybody take their seats? And we will begin. Commissioner Assil.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished member of the Congress Black Caucus, let me say brother and sister, and also friends. It is a really pleasure for me today to speak here with you at this gathering of the African Brain Trust in Washington, D.C. First of all, I bring the warmest greeting from the chairperson of the African Union Commission, Her Excellency Dr. Dlamini Zuma, who would have loved to be here with you, but could not be present because of unavoidable circumstances. I have the honor and also the privilege of representing her at this august occasion and bring her sincere and warm greetings. I would like also to congratulate the Honorable Karen Bass for the organization of this important event, as well as her unflagging dedication and support for the African Union cause. She has been a true daughter of the continent, a strong advocate of U.S.-Africa strategic partnership, and a friend of the African Union. And when she calls, we must answer. The African Union, the African continent must answer. Thank you very much. I also must recognize and appreciate the historic and unflagging bipartisan support that Africa has always enjoyed in successive U.S. administration and in both houses of Congress. President Obama, who was the first U.S. president to pay an official visit to the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, with the bipartisan support of Congress, has broadened and deepened the scope of U.S. engagement with Africa. In this context, I would like to thank the member of the Congressional Black Caucus for their valuable support and commendable effort for the African cause. It will be remiss of me not to acknowledge the incredible role that the Congressional Black Caucus played, along with the current administration, toward the renewal and reauthorization of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, and for this, we continue to be grateful. In the entire membership of the Congressional Black Caucus, we're glad to know for sure that we can always you always have a listening ear and a helping hand on Capitol Hill, and that eminent son and daughter of Africa, though far from home, continue to actively contribute to the cause of the development of our continent, Africa. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my address today will focus on the role of the African Union in the promotion of peace and prosperity, on the continent, as well as the African Agenda 2063 and the plan for the structural transformation of the continent. The African Union as you all know, is a political institution, and its platform, it's a platform for channeling African political will toward common African objectives. The first 50 years of the African Union in its existence as the Organization of African Unity that was created in 1963 focused on the colonization and political independence of the continent. At their assembly held in Addis Ababa in May of 2013, the African Union Head of State and Government, in their 50th celebration, while celebrating past successes and acknowledging challenges encountered along the way, rededicated themselves to the continent development and came up with what they call the Agenda 2063. It is a shared strategic framework for inclusive growth and also sustainable development. This Agenda 2063, it's aimed at developing a growth trajectory for the continent for the next 50 years. So based on extensive consultation with stakeholders across the continent, including women, youth, historians, diaspora, and others, especially women and youth, who are the majority of the citizens of Africa, Agenda 2063 embodies the Africa we want, building up upon the Africa we have. So the Africa we have, and that 50 years is the Africa we want. Our Agenda 2063 first objective is really to eradicate poverty, build shared prosperity through strategies for inclusive growth, job creation, agricultural production, investment in science, technologies, and research, and innovation, regulation that guarantee gender equality, youth empowerment, and the provision of basic services, including health, education, shelter, water, and sanitation. Now, some of you might say, what is different? We all know that Africa had such long path planned before, such as the Legal Plan of Action, the Abuja Treaty, the New Partnership for African Development, NEPAD, to name just a few. Further, we also know that the African Union Commission has developed continental framework, such as the Comprehensive Agriculture Development Program, Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, Africa Mining Vision, Boosting Intra-African Trade, Accelerated Industrial Development for Africa, among others, to support member states of the Union in their development effort toward the structural transformation. However, we noted that one of the weaknesses of the past plan, program, and all these agendas are the lack of implementations due to the number of reasons, including absence of clear implementation plan, as well as resources for this implementation. Basically, we make plans and we're asking for others to come and finance them. Limited participation and also involvement of the local African population, including women especially, leading in certain cases to lack of ownership. So we have seen this, and therefore, any agenda that the African Union have to come through, it must address certain challenges. Because as of today, if Africa has to implement even half of what we have agreed, as head of state agreed, I think we will be maybe the fastest growing, prosperous continent of the world. So in a move aimed at ensuring the realization of this Agenda 2063, the African Union Commission coordinated the preparation of that first 10-year implementation plan of this grand vision. So the vision needs to be translated into implementation plan, measurable target with financial means and so forth. This plan shows the collective responsibilities of the member states, of the regional economic communities, as well as the African Union Commission. This implementation plan is also reviewed every 6 months by the head of state and government during their summit in January and also in July. As part of this 10-year implementation plan, we have decided about key flagship projects, identified, of course, by the head of state and government for the overall vision of that Agenda 2063. Some of these flagship projects include integrated high-speed train. We want to have a high-speed, but why do we want to have just a train? Basically, we're late, we can learn from others, and therefore we should go to good technology, the latest technology, high-speed train. I think it will be nice for any African to leave, for example, Cairo via train to South Africa on vacation, tourism, and so forth. I think it's very important for us. The other, some of the high-speed, flagship, the African passport. As you all know, today, movement of people in Africa is very difficult. And if you look at the African Union Commission especially, our raison d'etre is integration. But how do you talk about integration without movement of people? We must move correctly. For example, an African, to move from one country to another, most of the time, the foreigner has easy access to that country. But we do have problem with ourselves. So how do we integrate? We want to talk about a continental free trade area. We know that Africa is a big continent, it's an attractive continent, but it's fragmented, 54 countries. Our markets are too small to justify huge amount of investment into that continent. Because of the market fragmentation, we must come up with that grand continental free trade area by 2017. But of course, goods do not move themselves. We must accompany that by the movement of people. And the good thing is, during the July 2016 summit, we have launched an African Union passport. Head of state have received it. The first ladies have received it. The ambassadors accredited to the African Union in Addis Ababa have received it. And actually the next plan is to give that passport to our African Union member state, and to give it to their citizens, whether being service passport, regular passport, or diplomatic passport, because I think it will be a big job for the African Union really to do all the nitty-gritty detail about the passport. So this is for us, it's a huge step, and I think it's a huge step that goes to the credit of my boss, Dr. Dlamini Zuma. She wants to ensure that this is launched, is effective before she leaves office. Africa commodity strategy. As you all know, Africa is endowed with natural resources. You can talk about mineral oil, you can talk about mining, you can talk about arable land. We have everything. But how do you reconcile this rich Africa with poor people? That paradox. And we must find a commodity strategy so that we're not reactive to prices. When the prices go down, our economy go completely down. How do we ensure that actually the shock is less? How do we industrialize? How do we make sure that we use agriculture, that the non-perishable, thing like agriculture to feed ourselves and also to contribute to feed the world. So it's very important. We have everything. The arable land, as I said, 60% of the whole world arable land is in Africa. So it's important that we industrialize, we diversify, so that we don't be, really subjected to shock of prices of oil and mineral resources going up and down. As I said, we talk about the continental free trade area. Establishment of African air transport market is very important. Today, basically, you don't see a lot of African, airline. I think we have Ethiopian Airline and few others, but it's very important that we don't duplicate, but we can say, okay, how do we strengthen what we have? How do we make sure that we're connected so that when we want to go, from West Africa to Central Africa, we don't go to Europe and come back to Africa. And that's actually also increased the cost of goods. It's affect our competitiveness, and it's very important that really we can be also able to move. Now, universities are very important. We all know that, actually, my boss always said, one of the most important resources that Africa have is really our human resources. Our human resources, if we deal with them correctly, it will be an asset to Africa and also to the world. But if we don't empower them with skill, with education, whether being high, vocational training, high-level education, there will be a threat to Africa and also to the world. We have seen, African going to Europe, African coming to America, and so forth to migrate. Why they're migrating? Because they're looking for better jobs. So creation of job is very important, but in order for us to create job, we must give them the skill necessary so that they can, come and work. And the chairperson said, my boss, is saying always that we want to see African to travel, but we want to see them coming through the airport with good passport, not going through the sea and dying in the sea. That's a problem. So I think it's very important that we really talk about empowering our youth, the women, with the right skill, the right type of education. And I want to talk about silencing the gun. If you talk about by 2020, that's a head of state decision. If you look at Africa today, you will see a lot of, especially on the media, a lot of problem here. People are killing here, some other people are hungry. The unfortunate part is, really the media is only projecting the bad things. I think Africa is a big continent. It's 54 continents. If you look at the continent, yes, we have problems. But actually, these are some of the things that we can also say the good things about what is happening in Africa and also the problems and how do we address them. In order for us to address this issue of silencing the gun, we must deal with this issue in a more holistical way. Holistical way means the structural transformation that our continent requires. We must empower our people, as I said, with education. We must have free movement of people so that they don't migrate and kill themselves on the sea, youth. We must, talk about human rights, democracy, and ensuring that there is no impunity. It's very important that we look at it on a more holistical way so that we can address this issue properly. Because if we don't look at all of this item, we cannot be able to silence the gun. Now, of course, as a Commissioner of Trade, it's very important that, to emphasize a little bit about, the continental market, market fragmented. And as you know, the trade agenda, in my view, is the most important thing. Trade is important for Agenda 2063, for structural transformation, industrialization transformation is important so that we can change, we can create the job, we can have inclusive job and move forward. But I think my role is more to talk about this peace and security and also prosperity. Now, we all know that there is no real prosperity without peace and no long-term peace without prosperity. In this regard, the silencing the gun is fundamental pillar of the Agenda 2063 and is connected, as I said, to the structural transformation. Now, to talk about, at this point, I would like to state that the continent has made great strides in democracy, as well as improved governance, all toward peace and security, aiming to that. The AU has adopted several norms and standards as policies to support the deepening of democratic governance on the continent. These instruments provide guidance on the minimum standard expected of member states in strengthening democratic societies. In addition, it has established a number of institutions to support popular participation in governance, human rights, and indeed democratic institution buildings. There are key institutions which include Pan-African Parliament, the African Court on Human and People Rights, as well as the Commission on Human and People Rights. In order also to support the operationalization and conflict management agenda of the peace and security architecture, the AU also established the African governance architecture as a framework for coordination of democracy and governance initiative among AU organ, institution, and regional economic communities. Now I can tell you that the AU, for example, always sent a team of observers to any election in Africa. There are long-term observers and also short-term observers. The long-term observer will go to the field, will observe what is happening on the country before the election, and then you will have the team that will monitor the election. But actually, the chairperson is more proactive. When she sees that she's sensing that there will be problem in an election, usually we send a mission before that, a mediation. So not to wait until that is result into conflict or something before we go. That's the case actually was in Burundi. You know, we talked to the president before and so forth. So I think that we also try to be very proactive so that we don't end up in problems always. All of these initiatives indicate the primacy of transformative democratic system as key to attaining the development agenda of the AU as contained in Agenda 2063. The AU believes that our investment in improving democratic governance space must result in the delivery of the intersect and instrumental value of democracy to its citizens. In this vein, the AU seeks to ensure that the enjoyment of both political and socio-economic rights for African citizens through the universal ratification and implementation of the AU norm and standard on democratic governance. Now, in the meantime, as I said, we are still confronted with various dimensions of crisis situation in Africa, while increasing proactive engagement by the African Union. Recently, African Union missions are in Mali, Central African Republic, and prevailing engagement in Somalia and against terrorism group in northern Uganda, and also the Lake Chad Basin Commission state as in point. You know, we all know about the Boko Haram and so forth, so I think that we're all dealing with these issues. The issues of extremism is also important that we need to address it, radicalism, so it's very important, as I said, the issue is looked in a more holistic way. There is also a strong commitment of African Union member states with the support of its commission to address the security challenges in Africa, and the peace and security architecture has attained at least the minimum required level of operationalization. The Africa Standby Force, despite some challenges, has attained operational readiness. The Peace and Security Council contribute to demonstrate its capacity to make political decisions to prevent and timely response to crisis in Africa, and the continental early warning system, which I talked about, has been established in coordination with the regional economic communities. Now, this narrative of progressive response to peace and security challenge will be incomplete without reference to effort being made in the financing of the Union. As I said, we develop plans, we must think about how do we finance them. The decision taken by the African Union Summit in Kigali in July 2016 is currently being implemented. This is actually the reason that the chairperson could not be here with us, because Minister of Finance are meeting today to actually make sure that this decision is implemented. The decision is done, but to see how do we implement that decision. Now, linked to this process is the effort toward the authorization of the Peace and Security Fund. In this respect, it is expected that there will be 3 windows encompassing the peace and security, namely the mediation and conflict prevention, institutional building and peace support operations, and also yes, these are the 2. We're convinced that this effort by the African Union Commission will ensure greater ownership, predictability, and also sustainability in the response of crisis on the continent. The progress made by the African Union in its peace and security effort must be balanced with realistic expectation of what this continent body can and should effectively do in the future. The political legitimacy of the African Union suggests that its comparative advantage not only in time deployment of peace support operation, but also more importantly in the necessity of effective mediation and conflict prevention. To put this in proper perspective, international partners are currently spending at least 900 million annually in Somalia alone in support of the African mission in Somalia. Substantially less than 10% of this amount would require on an annual basis to undertake effective conflict prevention and mediation through the African Union on the continent. So if we don't let it until it arrives to that point, I think it will be more effective money-wise and also actually human-wise. Indeed, you will agree with me that there is an urgency to move away from the dominance on peace and security to conflict prevention in Africa as part of our collective attempt to support Africa in silencing the gun by 2020. Now, I want to, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, the key takeaway from all of this point I have outlined is that the continent and the African Union still need your support and your partnership. Africa needs your friendship and partnership, not only for the peace and security of the continent, but also for the prosperity of this continent. As these two issues, peace and security, prosperities, are fundamentally linked. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
How about another round of applause for our High Commissioner Asil? We know that the chairperson of the AU, Dr. Zuma's, her term is up, and it was actually up a few months ago, but they could not come to a decision about who the next chairperson should be, so she has agreed to stay on until the beginning of the next year, but maybe we should nominate Commissioner Asil for that, huh? I think she did a fabulous job. Well, I appreciate everyone for staying for our last panel of the day. It has been a long day, but I think you would agree it has been very fruitful. Our focus today was really to look at U.S.-Africa policy into the next administration. And I know I have been a big proponent of really trying to see what we could do as a U.S. government and U.S. people to really increase the capacity of the African Union. And I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to go to Addis Ababa and to visit the African Union, but to me it's very exciting to go there, and I love the emblem of the African Union. The emblem of the African Union is the map of Africa with no lines distinguishing between nations. I think it is a wonderful statement. Well, I would like to bring up the leader of our next panel, Sally Booker. Sally Booker currently serves as the Vice President for External Relations at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Previously, he was Special Advisor to the Executive Director of the United Nations Economic Commission on Africa. Earlier, Mr. Booker directed 2 international human rights organizations and was the founding director of Africa Action. He also directed the Africa Program at the Council on Foreign Relations and served as the Ford Foundation Program Officer in Eastern and Southern Africa. He was an Associate Director of the Catholic Relief Services in Southern Africa and earlier served as a professional staff member for the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. So join me in welcoming Sally Booker, who will introduce our next and final panel for the day. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Is this mic on? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying for this last panel. People feel free to move down toward the front so we can actually see who you are. We don't bite. This last panel is going to focus on security and democracy in Africa. And we want to focus on the next administration, as Congresswoman Bass said, and what we think should be the priorities for the next administration in terms of promoting security and democracy in Africa. But also what should be the priorities of the African diasporas in the United States for promoting security and democracy in Africa, either by influencing policymakers or by doing other kinds of work directly. First, I should say, as the Congresswoman introduced me, I'm a vice president at the U.S. Institute of Peace. So I have to begin by saying that the views that I will be sharing with you are my own views and not those of the U.S. Institute of Peace. That gives me a little greater freedom. I want to thank all the previous panelists and keynote speakers who contributed to the Africa Brain Trust discussion today. Our panel focuses, I think, on something that's entirely different than what we've been talking about earlier today. This panel, in a way, focuses on our political struggles, because democracy is a struggle. It's always a work in progress. And the struggle for democracy, for people in Africa, and for people of African descent in this country needs your participation, needs your insights, needs your involvement. I have to begin by noting the fact that we're having this session here in Washington, D.C. And as you all know, D.C. is the only state in the United States with a majority of people of African descent. And yet we don't have statehood. So that struggle should be considered part of our larger Pan-African political agenda as well. I'm delighted that the title of this panel is Security and Democracy in Africa. Previous U.S. policies, particularly during the Cold War, used to suggest that the two were mutually exclusive. You either could promote security or you could promote democracy. And in the interest of stability, you would have to sacrifice human rights. Some people would argue that there's a threat of this happening again because of our preoccupation in security terms with the so-called war on terrorism or combating violent extremism. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to pose a couple questions or definitions. So the first one is, when we talk about security, I'm going to ask our panelists in their remarks if they can refer to the distinction between state security and human security. What kind of security are we helping to promote and achieve? And I'm not suggesting that the two are mutually exclusive, but that I would like to hear the richness of how we talk about security. Secondly, I want us to have some general agreement on our definitions of democracy. Now, the American president, Abraham Lincoln, perhaps had the most poetic definition, which is why it's so often repeated, which is of the people, by the people, and for the people. But as Ta-Nehisi Coates recently wrote in his excellent book, Between the World and Me, the problem is, what does the term people actually mean when people say that? When we say of the people, by the people, and for the people, who's included, who's excluded? That question is the key question, not only here, but throughout Africa as well. So as I turn to our panelists who are going to speak for 10 to 15 minutes each about their respective regions of focus, I want to draw their attention to some key questions. One of which is, we have to recognize the progress that was made in the 90s. Since 1991, we've seen this fascinating trend of an end of one-party rule, an end, for the most part, of military dictatorship, the advent of multipartyism, competitive elections. We've witnessed incumbents in power who have been peacefully rejected through the ballot box on no less than 36 occasions. That's something that's significant. But we also need to ask ourselves, has democracy stalled in Africa? Are we witnessing reversals? In the 2000s, there have been significant setbacks, some of which we will talk about. But we have also witnessed progress, and significant progress in numerous cases. Just to mention a few, Nigeria's peaceful transition of power in its most recent election, or the Jasmine Resolution in Tunisia, and other positive aspects of the Arab and North African Spring. But we have to acknowledge we're facing some very serious trends and threats, such as the undemocratic extension of political power, political rule. We have 9 leaders in Africa who've been in power for more than 20 years. We have 3 who've been in power for more than 30 years. We have a new wave of third-term wannabes, those heads of state who want to extend their power for a third term. And we're also witnessing the promotion of what might become family dynasties in a number of countries. To mention but a few, DRC, Gabon, Togo, but possibly Angola, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and others. So these are some of the concerns that I hope our colleagues will address, and I'm sure will address in our discussion. I'm first going to turn to Kamisa Kamara, who is the Senior Program Officer for West and Central Africa at the National Endowment for Democracy, where she oversees a multi-million grant portfolio to support civil society organizations in those 2 sub-regions. She's also the founder and co-chair of the Sahel Strategy Forum, and she will be speaking about the Sahel. Prior to working for NED, Kamisa worked with the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES. She holds an MA in International Economics and Development and a BA in International Relations, and she's pursuing yet another MA here in Washington. And after she speaks primarily on the Sahel, I will then turn to Mvemba Dizolele, who's an old colleague and friend. He's a professorial lecturer in African Studies at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, and he's the author of the forthcoming biography, Mobutu, The Rise and Fall of the Leopard King. It's a book I've been waiting on for years, and I told him he's just got to finish it. I should mention that Mvemba was embedded within the United Nations peacekeepers in Congo's Ituri district and South Kivu province as a reporter in 2006. His analysis then and subsequently has been published in various outlets, from the New York Times to the Journal of Democracy to Foreign Affairs. He's testified before Congress and the United Nations, and he holds an International Master of Business Administration and a Master of Public Policy, and he's also a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. So with that, I would like to turn to Kamisa. I will be gentle but firm with my management of time.
All right. Thank you, Sally, and good afternoon, everyone. So I will be focusing my remarks or presentation on the Sahel region. The Sahel is a relatively new region of concern in sub-Saharan Africa. Africa's Sahel has been in the news, in the international news since 2012, largely because of its increasing political and instability and insecurity. And it's really since the military coup of Mali of 2012 that the region has been on the forefront of U.S. foreign policy and other bilateral partners and multilateral partners such as the African Union, the European Union, and the UN. Today, the term Sahel is used increasingly in a geopolitical context to refer to countries of the Western Sahel, which are Mauritania, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Nigeria / Northern Nigeria, and Chad. And these countries have become destabilized politically and more recently on the security level, with first the fallout from Muammar Gaddafi overthrow in Libya, and recent major terrorist attacks in Mali and Burkina Faso's capital cities. But I started working on the Sahel region way before the region was cool. The generic language that we hear about the Sahel is that security and development go together and cannot be separated, and that is because the region has been facing challenges which include poor governance, food insecurity, humanitarian issues, etc. So security goes hand in hand with development. Without development, you cannot have security. Without security, you cannot have development. However, my main argument here is that since Mali's military coup in 2012 in the Sahel and more than anywhere else in the world, political campaigns, political victories have been predominantly contingent upon a candidate's ability to bring back security and to secure its national borders. So forget about strong economic programs or education plans and all that good stuff. There's definitely a fierce battle going on in the Sahel region between security and democracy is not winning. To give you a few examples, in Mali, back in 2013, the reason why Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta was elected as president of the country is that he was perceived as the only presidential candidate who had the clout to bring back security and to make sure that Mali becomes stable. In Nigeria, the Boko Haram issue definitely played a role, even small, in the presidential elections. Buhari ran on the issues of corruption and security, and had the Boko Haram issue not existed, first of all, the elections would have happened on time, but the outcome of the elections could have been quite different. Looking at Niger, we have pretty much the same situation. Mahamadou Issoufou won a second term as president back in March. And in the period leading up to the election, the issue of security definitely played a big role in the election and in his favor. For example, in the border town of Difa, I don't know if you know Niger, but Niger shares a border with northern Nigeria. And Difa is an opposition stronghold. And Boko Haram attacked the Niger military multiple times in that region. And the state of emergency, because of that, was extended multiple times, preventing candidates from campaigning, especially during late hours. And as part of the government's measures, security forces have had additional powers to conduct day and night searches without a warrant. And conveniently, just before the presidential elections, the military chief of staff announced that the military forces of Niger had almost won the war against Boko Haram. I guess if that was true, we would have certainly heard about it. The issue of security also helped Mahamadou Issoufou win the elections and get rid of any credible opposition. Just a month before the election, because of the insecurity throughout the country, he decided to put together a government of national unity, and what that did was basically weaken the opposition and making sure that he didn't have any opponent running against him in the 2015 elections. So now several voices have come from within Niger, Mali, Chad, and Mauritania, especially from human rights civil society groups, to denounce the abuses of the current security apparatus. As a consequence of the government's security priorities in the Sahel and domestically, other issues such as the economy, health, or education have taken a backseat during the campaign and also after the election. And that's particularly dramatic because most Sahel countries actually sit at the bottom of the UN Human Development Index. Other complaints that we've heard from our civil society partners on the ground is that the security apparatus appears especially strong on intelligence collection, which means that there is an unknown degree of surveillance and monitoring within these countries. And in the light of terrorist threats, we're seeing in the Sahel the reemergence of what we call in French an état policier. So you have plenty of those, Niger, Mauritania, Mali. So there has definitely been a shift, and a recent shift that I believe all started with the military coup in Mali back in 2012, where security trumps everything else. Just a few months ago, the French Prime Minister Manuel Valls visited both Burkina Faso and Mali. He did not take his foreign minister with him, but he took his defense minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian. So this is first an indication of the importance of France's military role in the region, but also that security is maybe that one issue that the international community can relate to when it comes to the Sahel region. As a conclusion, both international and domestic support have been contingent upon a president's or a candidate's ability to manage security and to secure its borders. The deteriorating security situation in the Sahel has coincidentally increased the powers of its leaders within their borders, but also internationally. I'm not sure that Idriss Déby of Chad, Buhari of Nigeria, or Mahamadou Issoufou of Niger have ever been so powerful in Bamako, in London, in Paris, in Brussels, as they are today. Because security apparently has not only become a cross-cutting issue in the Sahel region, but it looks like peace doesn't come from God anymore. It probably comes from presidents. So the NED is not allowed to make formal policy recommendations when it comes to the United States. So I'm going to speak in my personal capacity. I believe Camisa is allowed to make some policy recommendations. In my personal opinion, I believe that the United States is not properly organized to deal with the numerous issues that the Sahel is currently facing. There is a need for a U.S. special envoy for the Sahel. I know that Mvemba is going to be talking about Central Africa. They are lucky they have a U.S. special envoy. I think that the U.S. definitely needs one. That will definitely show that the U.S. is supporting the efforts that other multilateral organizations are putting forward in the Sahel. Second question or comment that I would like to make in the way we are organized at State Department is that the problems of the Sahel cannot be separated from those of Northern African countries. Terrorist groups like Ansar Dine, Akim, and Al Mourabitoun have their roots in Algeria, and they operate across borders. You find them in Mali, you find them in Burkina Faso, you find them in other countries of the Sahel. Yet, the US State Department continues to divide the region into two bureaus. So you have one linking North Africa to the Middle East and not to Sub-Saharan Africa, even though DoD has tried to do that. The United States should definitely rethink its role in the Sahel region. Is there a need for stronger partnerships with European and African partners? Definitely. Can the United States continue to afford leading from behind in the Sahel region? I don't think so. Final recommendation that I would like to make is that the next administration or the next woman who will be elected as US president should take steps to address the shortcomings of the TSCTP, which is the Trans-Saharan Counter-Terrorism Partnership. Security is definitely important throughout the world, in Africa, in the Sahel region, but I think we're seeing the shortcomings of the heavy security approach in the region. There are other strategies on the Sahel that are more effective, such as the EU's strategy for the Sahel and the United States, the United Nations regional integrated strategy for the Sahel. So quickly, maybe peace could also come from the diaspora. I know that there are some diaspora members here. I think the diaspora should be quite creative in dealing with the issues of the Sahel. Please go speak to your Congress people and tell them that the U.S. needs a special envoy for the Sahel. And what we're seeing is that African states, or even just states in general, have a better time dealing with the other states, but however, dealing with non-state actors is quite complicated. I think that the diaspora could definitely play a role in it. I think this concludes my remarks, and I am looking forward to a conversation.
All right. Thank you very much, Camisa. And now let me turn to Mvemba.
Thank you for having me here. I'd like to thank the Office of the Honorable Congresswoman Karen Bass. I'd also like to thank you for taking your time to listen to what we have to say. I'm going to be speaking about Central Africa, and I just want to define it a little bit. So we know, is this better?
Yeah, that's good.
No?
I think so.
Okay. Is this better? All right. Okay, so I just want to define the region that I'm referring to when I say Central Africa. So we're going from the Gulf of Guinea, from Sao Tome and Principe, to Equatorial Guinea, to Gabon, to Cameroon, to Congo Brazzaville, to Chad, to Central African Republic, South Sudan, the DRC. Then we have Angola, which extends all the way into Central Africa. And then on the other side, we have Rwanda and Burundi. And Uganda, which invites itself into Central Africa so often. So when we talk about democracy and security in this region, first of all, it's important for us to know that we're really talking about a social contract. And social contract is simply that the people have come together within a certain understanding to say we will have a state, a government, to which we'll link with certain rights in exchange for security and better life. That's really the bottom line, right? Back of the envelope definition of what we're talking about. So that means that the people will relinquish certain of their right to have these benefits, quote unquote, expect certain things from that government or that state. Africa faces a lot of challenges. We hear a lot about growth rate and all kind of other good positive stuff. But Central Africa remains the mess and basket case of Africa, right? It's the region that is arguably the most endowed in terms of natural resources, but it's actually pretty messy. Let me just give you a sense. So the longest serving leaders in Africa are all found in Central Africa. We have Obiang Nguema from Equatorial Guinea, 37 years. Sassou Nguesso, 37 years with a few recesses and breaks in between. Paul Biya, 34 years. José Eduardo dos Santos in Angola, 37 years. Museveni, 30 years and still going. Paul Kagame, 22 years. And very beloved of his people. We just had a referendum to lift term limit from the Constitution. So what's happening in the region? Why is it such a tough place to be? I think in part is because the engagement of Westerners into the region has been particularly driven by natural resources. This goes as way back to the time of colonization. In the case of countries like the DRC, you all remember the specter of King Leopold. And that meant that in the context of the Cold War, access to resource was paramount. And at all costs, we needed more stability. We didn't want to hear about anything else because stability, of course, meant security. And this is where we ask, who's security? Of course, it's the security of the people who are getting access to the resources, which for the most part, were not the local. So this is a problem that you see across the board. Equatorial Guinea, it's oil. Congo Brazzaville, it's oil. Gabon, it's oil. Chad, it's a bunch of other things. DRC, you can guess what it is. So failure then to deliver on that front meant that it all became about the security of the state. The security of the state is just that. You have no right. The state determines what the threats are. And most of the time, you don't know what the threats are and what you're being accused. So you often are accused of threatening the state, which, by definition, you cannot really say what it is. It's on their side. So with that, literally, we ended up with a kind of 4 types of what I call the military in Africa. You know, when we talk about security, I always say there is a very basic definition I have about security. When I talk about this state security, for you to determine if you're living in a safe place, regardless of what the analyst at the desk office in Washington says about your country, because DC may determine that your country is pretty stable. That doesn't mean that you're feeling stable living in that country. So I always say that means, the way you define that is when you see a man in uniform, typically it's men, yeah. When you see a man in uniform with his AK-47, how do you feel? If your gut feeling is saying you need to steer away, stay clear of the guy, or then you know that you're in a very insecure place. If your gut feeling, you can say bonjour, monsieur, and have a good chat with them. That's another way you know that you're in a country that is relatively safe. So because of this stuff, we end up with not Republican armies. You know, so when you look at Africa, you find actually there's 4 types of military. The first one is what I call the Republican army. It's professional, it's adequate, they serve the people, they don't serve a regime, they don't serve a region. And this is a dying breed of armies. Only a handful of countries still have this. So Senegal will be one, Mali is probably building one, Ghana is one, and then Tanzania. So, and the way you kind of get a sense of this is when there's political trouble in the country, where does the army stand? Where does the military stand? When the president of Senegal wanted to change the constitution, did the army line up with him or not? The second, and this Republican army type, they invest a lot in their training. They're independent for the most part. They invest a lot in civic education. And everything is clear, it's transparent, promotion, access to academies, and on. The second group is what I call non-Republican, professional, adequate military. Mostly they come from countries that had rebellions and some kind of conflict, and the winning militia or the winning rebel group transformed itself into the national army. Typically, they bring the same problem they were fighting when they were in the bush. It's typically regionally based or ethnically based. So countries that have this type of army will be Chad, will be Rwanda, Ethiopia, just to give you a couple of those. They don't invest in civic education. They typically invest in indoctrination, propaganda type of thing, why we need to do what we do. They perform relatively well. Then the third one is kind of non-professional, non-adequate, military. So this is kind of the DRC of the world. You find a mismatch. There used to be an army there that worked at one point, and then there was conflict, and then decided to sit around a table to have peace talks, and then they brought everybody together. So you have a patchwork of various militia or former military, some well-trained, some not well-trained. The chain of command is typically not clear. You don't get promoted unless you're from certain parts of the country. So it's a mess. And then the rest of Africa falls in the fourth category, which is all kinds of things in there. Right? So actually, I'll add South Africa to the Republican Army as well. So what is the result of this? The result is that these armies typically take the orders from their boss, who's the president, who a lot of times used to be the rebel leader himself. So it's a place where when you talk about security, it's already state security. It's also a type of place where you don't do your work, because when you do your work well, you're jeopardizing your own life. Right? It's just that clear. The better you do, the less likely you will stick around, because you'll be posing a threat just by doing what you're doing. So what does this mean then for the region like Central Africa? I think it means that we need to engage Central Africa much more seriously than we've done now. We've had some good democratic processes taking place. There were votes, but typically they fall short. The US is still looked upon as the beacon of democracy. It's the only superpower now. The US is also the country that likes to get involved in other people's businesses for a set of reasons, national security, strategic, whatever. But because the US loves to do these kind of things, we need to do it right. So looking at the last administration, I think the last administration did well in talking. We saw President Obama go to Ghana, go to Ethiopia. And I think it's dangerous in the sense that a lot of false hope, especially on the democratic front. President Obama goes to Ghana and says this is the end of the era of strong people, strong men, most of the time the men, that will build institutions. But yet when those strong men across Africa pushed back, the US did not have the backbone to stand up to them. In fact, that's why we continue seeing this people want to stay and cancel term limits continue. So that is not over yet. I think we needed more. What Africa needs also now, which we didn't see with the last administration, is Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall moment. I think it would have been fantastic for President Obama to go to a place like the DRC and say, Mr. Kabila, please step down at the end of your term. This is what your constitution says. I think we need to stop playing it safe. We like to go to where things work. It doesn't make any sense. There's no point of going to South Africa South Africa doesn't need that engagement at the same level as this big chunk of the land. So I think this is something that we need to start considering seriously. For the next administration, I think it will be important to really engage Africa, not to the detriment of the people, because when we talk about security, we're talking about some pie-in-the-sky security, which typically doesn't come. You know, we've invested a lot of money in Chad, a lot of money in Gabon, AFRICOM, other training. Boko Haram is still rising, is still expanding. People are still unhappy, so what are we doing? And we're still not safe here, not any safer than we were when we started. So I think we need to engage in a meaningful way, stand by our position, drop the nonsense that we typically use. You know, it's the internal affairs, we don't meddle. But we do meddle if we're training the military. So we need to have more to say. We should engage the forces that bring change in those countries. And this is civil society. There are people in the countries that are working hard. The notion that we'll bring in experts to help these people understand what they need to do is ridiculous, right? So the case of Nigeria, which Sally just mentioned, Nigeria had a great transition with the democracy. It was all done by Nigerians. I mean, we gave them some little help, but the work was done by Nigerians. You know, I just had dinner with Professor Jega yesterday, who was the chairperson of the Independent Electoral Commission there. We need to also, I think in the case of the US, for us in the diaspora, all of us from across the Atlantic and here, really to engage a little more in the way that we've done so far. When I was a child in Zaire, you know, I grew up in the shadow of the Rumble in the Jungle. Noir Américain was something that we were in awe of, you know, a black American. They represented something. We were proud, you know, to see what they were doing. We read everything we could, Muhammad Ali, everybody else. The Black Caucus, Congressional Caucus with South Africa, again, the Ron Dellums of the world, people we looked up to. It's my view, just my view, is like that is diluted quite a bit. So people like Congresswoman Karen Bass are just standing there, a few of them. We lost a little bit of that gravitas. I think we need to reclaim that to engage more the people on the continent and the next administration. And then finally, on the continent, I think we need also to engage with local organization, regional organization. I believe we heard a lot about good stuff that the AU is doing. I believe maybe it's the time to fold the AU. And let's go back to the drawing board and focus on sub-regional organizations like ECOWAS, like SADC, because those are more integrated. They have interests that make sense to them, and they can do things in a way that is manageable. I think the AU maybe should just be reduced into a Peace and Security Commission, which would be an agency that will fund better. Otherwise, it sounds more propaganda, and I think that's very dangerous. Just to illustrate, you know, false hope, in French we say, l'espoir fait vivre, which means hope gives you life. But my argument is that false hope kills. You know, there's nothing that you can do worse to any individual than give them false hope when you know that it's not going to deliver. So to illustrate, you know, I was giving a talk one time at the AU. It was a big audience, and I saw a lot of white folks in the back. Nothing against white folks. But I was wondering, I say, are these South Africans? You know, because we have one white on the continent, right? So I said, this may be South Africans. Then at the end, they came to me, they started asking questions, and I was polite, I answered. And I'm like, who the hell are you? Yeah. But in the most diplomatic way, pretty much. They said, we are New Zealanders. Right? So they were New Zealanders and they were donors. So because they were New Zealand and they were donors, so they were up in the business, right? This is not the idea that drove the creation of the precursor of the AU in 1963. It was not, I cannot think a minute that in 63, the founding father was thinking about New Zealand as a donor in our business. Thank you very much.
So I think folks can start lining up with their comments and questions, and as I give people time to do that, I'd like to thank our speakers for their excellent presentations. I'm sure in the course of our discussion, and I want to make sure we have as much of a discussion as possible, we'll cover other parts of the continent that we haven't yet touched on. like East Africa, the Horn of Africa, and other parts of Southern Africa. There's a lot of interest, obviously, in recent developments in Ethiopia, in the upcoming elections in Ghana and in Kenya, the situation in Zimbabwe, and of course, obviously, the recent developments in South Africa with regard to elections and democracy. So what I'm going to do is go back and forth from the two lines, taking 2 questions or comments each, and then allow our panelists to respond, and then take 4 more. So I'm going to start over here on the left first, and if you could please tell us your name and identify any organizational affiliation you may have.
Right. Well, thank you. Florindo Chivukut from Friends of Angola. I was just wondering, what do you take on new crackdown on social media and internet freedom overall? I'm referring to the legislation passed in the Angolan Congress. I think Zimbabwe so far sued. I think Kenya also had some case as well, and other places. What that means for democracy in continent. And my second question and last would be, what do you think about Angola rule on region, sub-Saharan Africa? I mean, it's a dictatorship, has been in power, as you said, for 37 years. But I mean, there's no any sign of change. And lately, the government has been investing heavily on buying weapons rather than investing in education, healthcare. So I was wondering, what do you think about it? Thank you.
Thank you. And here?
Good afternoon. My name is Murad Ekbal, and I'm served as Deputy Director of the Center for International and Comparative Law. I've taught at 2 different universities. I want to close our day with the same question, or a different question, but related, that I asked this morning, and that is in regard to Africa. I mean, the title of this panel is Examining Security and Democracy in Africa. How I wish it were a little bit phrased differently, which is democracy and transparency leads to security in Africa, and not juxtapose democracy and security as 2 different components, both going in the same direction or being in tension with one another. And what I wanted to suggest, I'm grateful to the panelists' presentations. I want us to just for a moment pause and go back to the years 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of its satellite states. And at that time, we had an extraordinarily brilliant chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff by the name of General Shalikashvili, who realized that if we had failed states in Europe, the entire European Union would collapse. Now, if memory serves, there are 54 nations on the African continent. There are 50 states in the United States. I would suggest that we start pairing up national guards. There is already something in place through CENTCOM, through the Department of Defense, that focuses on Africa. But I would suggest that we pair up national guards to different countries in Africa, because military to military helps. One place I was very much involved in Maryland was through Bosnia-Herzegovina and Estonia. It helped bring about the Baltic Defense College. We can pair them up, and military to military have a much simpler language. They understand each other better. And that way we could achieve security, not at the expense of democracy and transparency in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. One comment or question over here on the left. Identify yourself, please.
Yeah, my name is Chimalangu, and you briefly touched on term limits, and I wanted to know how do you propose we solve like term limits, either with the AU, having member states sign term limits? And my second question is on the Independent Electoral Commission, which actually worked in Nigeria, the INEC, and lately we see that the political parties in Kenya have had the Electoral Commission under their pockets. And so how do you suggest we have a transparent Electoral Commission that can survey electoral elections in Africa?
Thank you. And one other comment or question right here.
Hello, hi, my name is Zakia Posey, and I have a couple of questions. This panel focused mostly on Central Africa and the Sahel, but as you all mentioned, the Horn of Africa is important and in turmoil at the moment. Many of you are aware that Ethiopia has been rocked by protests, Oromo protests, and recently other groups have also joined in. These protests really, I guess, protest against land dislocation and inequality that's resulting from ill-conceived development policies. And they've been going on for nearly a year. My question is, you all are experts on the panel. I'd like three of you to, if you could make 2 recommendations to the next administration, in what ways would you advise them to be preemptive rather than crisis-driven? So how would you, if you could give, I guess, 2 specific steps that the next administration could take to manage security and instability? And also, my second question would be, in what ways can we tie aid to accountability?
Thank you very much. So I'm going to take those 4 and allow our panelists to offer a response before the list gets too long, and then we'll come back to the questions. And just summarizing some of those that we have on Angola, the question of internet censorship, as well as government purchases of arms increasingly. We have the question of the relationship and the dynamic between security and democracy, and a particular proposal about pairing National Guards with forces in Africa. Term limits, how do you enforce it? Is it through a AU mechanism or how? Independent electoral commissions, how can we keep them honest? How can we keep them independent and ensure that independence? And on Ethiopia, the land dislocation, inequality, increasing protests and repression, what can the U.S. do? And finally, how can the U.S. be proactive in its efforts to promote democracy? So let me turn to Camisa first.
Thank you, Sally. Okay, so I have multiple answers for all of your questions. Let me start with the easiest. That will be the term limits issue. I've done some research about it, and that's really an issue that we've all been grappling with. Because it just seems so easy to change constitutions and remain in power, even though the original constitution says that the president is not allowed to stay longer. What I found out throughout my research is that both the African Union and the ECOWAS in West Africa have pushed for actual legislation or for a formal mechanism by which they would prevent states or presidents from extending their terms. And the opposition that they got was from actual presidents. And because the ECOWAS is driven by member states, because the AU is also driven by member states, they have not been able to do so. So I don't know what the solution is to term limits. As you know, it's really a localized issue. It's about local legislation. Where do you draw the line between a state sovereignty and us mingling with them and telling them, well, you shouldn't have that in the law. So I don't have an answer to that. Somebody mentioned National Guards here in the U.S. pairing up with military in Africa. I think these are programs that have been going on for a while. And actually, the first time I've heard about it is when Sanogo in Mali conducted the coup in 2012, and everybody was just scandalized because he had received training in the U.S. So this is the sort of consequences that we'll have to deal with, I guess. About the recommendations for the next administration, about being preemptive rather than crisis-driven, I think that the first thing that we'll have to look at is really DNG funding, democracy and governance funding. We cannot be, as arrogant to the point of saying, well, you know, this is the great things that we're doing in Africa when we're decreasing DNG funding. It just doesn't, it's not logical. So DNG funding should either be maintained at the current level or increased. And my second recommendations would be, and that's maybe because I work at NED and I see how effective strong civil society organizations can be and how effective they can be with working with their governments hand in hand in preventing third terms, for example, is to really fund strong civil society organizations in order for them to partner with you and not be a tool for the government and tell you when something is going on the ground. They can be your ears, your hands, and your brain, I guess, on the ground.
Thank you, Camisa. And Bemba?
Just a couple of things. I think Camisa has covered quite a bit. The crackdown on social media in Angola, it's something we see across the continent now. You know, every time, what technology has done is liberalize the political space in ways that state did not think about, right? Kids in Congo, kids in Angola have access to what's happening around the world on Facebook. When you have elections that are botched, political parties and opposition party can tally the result as they're sending it in. So an assault on the social media, the crackdown, is actually an assault on democracy. I think countries like the US need to take a firm stand on that because that's not different from curtailing the freedom of the press or any other freedom. So I think we should elevate that to that level. That's what I'll say about that. As far as the National Guard, Mr. Morris, I don't know if he's still here, that is actually already started. I know that a few countries that are doing that in Africa were already paired with the National Guard. And I agree that transparency, democracy, and security all go together because it's an issue really of oversight, right? Part of the challenge between democracy and security, even in countries where things seem to work well, is you end up, so if you take a country like Ghana, or where things are working relatively well, you go to the parliament and you meet members of parliament who sit on the Select Armed Forces Committee or Security and Defense. Most of those people in a lot of these countries have no military background, right? So it's quite common to find a member of parliament who doesn't know a difference between the platoon and the battalion. So not knowing that is very hard to engage the military. How do you approach them in terms of procurement leakages, corruption, and stuff? How do you let the weapon system they're trying to buy make sense? Because the president relies on a national security advisor who has all the power, try to block everyone else. And then you enter in this business of confidential, secret information. Angola wanted to buy an aircraft carrier just recently. You can imagine Angola need an aircraft carrier. I think the entire Navy will fit on the aircraft carrier, and there will still be space after that. Term limits, term limit is not the end of the world. You can be a country without term limits. There are many other ways to offset that. The UK doesn't have term limit. Germany doesn't have term limit. But what they have is they have institutions that work. They have checks and balances. People get voted out. So along with term limits, we have to have the counterbalances, right? So that president don't change the constitution. So the other mechanism and I think that's why I believe that the next administration should invest a lot of money into institution building. Follow up on that speech that President Obama made, actually start walking the walk, right? So that people have the power to carry out the duty of oversight in their countries. And then Ethiopia, to Zakia, I think we have a serious problem with the way we approach the so-called developmental states. Yeah? Because there's a school of thought in Washington and elsewhere where they say if people are feeding their people, if they're doing all this good stuff, if the GDP numbers look good, then we should support them. We should not disrupt them. Yeah? This is the argument that to be made about Rwanda, about Ethiopia. I don't buy that argument, personally, because I believe in fundamentals. I think are your fundamentals right? And the fundamentals should include freedom and human rights. Freedom as, those are the fundamentals. We cannot have numbers for the sake of numbers because most of the time they mean nothing to the woman at the market. Congo is one of the fastest growing economies, if you can believe that. But it's because the way they calculate it is just the copper and what is being sold. So if you're talking to somebody at the IMF, they tell you this story that looks like you're reading fiction. Because when you get to the field, there is no growth. It's growth without prosperity. There is no employment creation. There is no journalists are in jail, crackdown on social media, and we say, behold, this is a great state. We're going to support you. So that's what I mean by Obama going to Addis Ababa should have taken a bit of a stronger position than just kind of pat people in the back and say, I'm going to step down. So what? We know you're going to step down. What is that for us? Tell them something more. And that's it. So.
Thank you, Mvemba, and thank you for revealing that you're a fundamentalist, but a fundamentalist for democracy. So we're going to take two more on both sides here before returning to our panel, please.
Hi, my name is Kulani Jalata, and I came up with two questions while I was listening to Mr. Dizolele, but these are for everyone to answer if they would like. You mentioned, Mr. Dizolele, you mentioned that Obama visited Ghana and Ethiopia, and I immediately thought of when he visited Ethiopia and he praised the country for being a democracy, I think a year or so ago, and now it's clearly not the case. Ethiopia is very effective at leveraging its war on terror alliance with the U.S., and so the U.S. policy has been very hesitant at condemning what is clearly right now a chaotic and violent treatment of its citizens. 400 protesters were killed, probably more since November. Thousands are in prison. Political opposition members are in prison. Recently, a prison was set on fire, and people in this prison were killed by the fire and by live bullets. And so my question is, I'm assuming you believe that this policy of treating allies that are war on terror allies in a way that in a way that's not fair to actually building democracy is problematic. And if it is, how exactly can that policy be changed? My second question is, you said that we need to support civil societies and political opposition groups in countries across the continent. I'm thinking also about Ethiopia. But how exactly, are you saying that the U.S. government needs to be in these countries and support these, other groups? Because if you're also supporting the government, in places where the governments are cracking down on these opposition parties, what does that really look like when you're supporting other political opposition?
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah,
and identify yourself first.
My name is Juma, and most of the questions I really wanted to pose were posed by Kulane and Zakia here, so I just want to, I'm sorry I have bad cold, I just want to congratulate Professor Dizolele for his eloquent description of Africa and what's going on in the continent. Hopefully you will become as great as your countryman Mudumbi. So thank you for describing what's going on in Africa. Nothing good is going on in Africa. Africa is exceedingly corrupt. We might have been better off their colonialism, perhaps. I come from an Oromo ethnic group in Ethiopia, and the minority ethnic group has been killing my people left and right for the last 25 years. So those of us who are in the diaspora know what's going on in Africa, not necessarily only in Ethiopia, even in South Africa, in the Congo, and so on and so forth. So your description of Africa is accurate and correct one, and thank you for that, and that's my comment.
All right, thank you very much. Over here.
Hello, my name is Amani Badasso, and hopefully I'm not asking similar questions to some of the people in this room, but I'll just go ahead. Ethiopia is the host of the African Union and U.S. strategic ally on the war on terror in East Africa. And the country is on the brink of collapse and is currently a failed state in the making, with reoccurring anti-government protests occurring in various regions within the Ethiopian state. In addition to that, Ethiopia is known for its continuous human rights violations and marginalization of various other ethnicities with respect to the ruling party. What role specifically do you think the next administration should play in terms of foreign policy in order to deter a potential civil war in the making, support democracy, human rights, and security, and assist Ethiopia in addressing grievances and ensure transparency on behalf of the government? So if you could give the next administration one task or one possible foreign policy initiative that could deter the country from going into a civil war. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And a question here.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Kelly Scavala. I'm a peace operations student at George Mason University. And I just wanted to touch on one of the comments that someone said. I definitely don't think that anyone can argue the effects of European/U.S. policy towards Africa at the turn of the 19th century. But today, in regards to promoting long-term stability, is there a policy or initiative that can disrupt internal conflict between opposition leaders, which ultimately disrupts progressive institution building? And I ask this question because sometimes programs are implemented, but as soon as someone is elected, they get killed. And then when someone else comes in, that person gets killed. And it's just this continual cycle depending on the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to turn to our panelists again before returning to the audience to give them opportunity to reply. Camisa?
Okay, so I will start. I think that it's important to not let ourselves be frustrated with our governments. I think we don't have to be romantic about what is going on in our countries and in the continent in general, but let's not be radical about the fact that things are either going well or not going well. There are 54 countries on the continent. I think that we just have to look at things the way they are. My answer to Kulani's comment about civil society support. The NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, are funded by the US Congress. However, our positions and the way we fund programs or the way we decide which countries we're going to go in and find civil society organizations to fund really is totally independent from the US government. So when I mentioned CSO support, civil society support, or US government involvement with civil society organizations, basically what I meant was money. That's what we need. Finding good civil society organizations takes time. You might remember what happened back in the days with Burkina, with civil society organizations actually managing to come together and make sure that the president who wanted to stay longer left. Some of the civil society organizations that we, the NED, have funded found themselves in the group, in the Ballet Citoyen, which made sure that Blaise Compaoré left the country. We didn't do it. They did it. But they did it because they had the support of the NED. They had the support of other funders who were there and who were there to actually be a listening ear and who was supportive of whatever they were doing. So civil society support can go through different organizations, but some diaspora members here, nothing prevents you from finding these organizations and contributing. $100 goes a long way. I think that you should definitely think about that. And I think that's it.
I would like to offer Congresswoman Bass an opportunity to intervene for a special introduction.
And I hope our panelists and guests will forgive me, but I just couldn't resist. We have a very special guest that is here today, and I know that everybody here is very familiar with him because he is certainly a world as well as nationally known actor. He has been in many films as well as stage performances. He is known for being on Grey's Anatomy. He has been in Spike Lee films, and Africa is dear to him, dear to his heart, and I believe he was the first U.S. citizen to have dual citizenship with his native ancestral home of Sierra Leone. So please join me in welcoming Isaiah Washington.
First of all, thank you. I'm just gratified that, unfortunately for me, this is my first Africa Brain Trust that I've been able to attend since my dear friend Karen Bass has been doing them. So I'm here on some other matters that I found very important to me regarding the recent death of Darren Seals in Ferguson. So I find it a very interesting juxtaposition because I've spent the last 10 years fighting and trying to rebrand this dear country that I found out my ancestry lies in the Mende Timni peoples in Sierra Leone, and just how difficult and challenging it has been for the people there. And I was really remembering how at that time, in my myopia, intentionally, a lot of people were saying, well, Isaiah, what are you doing in America? And I finally can say that Karen and others, that although there are tensions on the continent that we're all aware of, and there are tensions here, I've always tried to see if there was a different kind of way to resolve an issue. But what I've been up to recently is coming up with a possible conversation, an idea to build a railway starting from Morocco, going through West Africa, ending in Angola, where I share ancestry with the Mbundu, and I also intend to seek citizenship there. The one problem that I've noticed over the years, and Kwame Nkrumah, I think, said it best, is that although Martin Luther King visited him, they felt there was no kinship from American Negroes and Africans. I even get that here, said, well, how can we be brothers and sisters when we don't share a kinship? I believe that DNA has memory. I believe that DNA is the answer to that argument, and that the time is now for us to table all dissent and table all issues and really go about the business of seeking a personal democracy. Waiting on the governments to see if democracy is going to work, I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon based on my experience in Sierra Leone. But what I am gratified is to see that there are still a lot of people in this room that really believe that Africa can be the best and Africans can be the best that there can be. Thank you for a lot of the things you said. You've been mentioning Angola a lot, which means to me, I need to get there and also get my French together. I spent some time with a good friend of mine, Jalali Mazouz, who's helping me put together this feasibility report. Hopefully I will be able to see everyone again to talk about how we can really talk about this railway seriously, which I know will come to the tune of about $100 billion. Don't know how we're going to get there, but I know we're going to get there. And I do know there's some issues with the Polisario, there's some issues in the Western Sahara. I am not educated on that front, but hopefully there are a lot of people in this room that I can be able to lean on, that we can seriously talk about that, because geopolitically, we all know what a railway does. We all know what a railway does. There has been many attempts since Cecil Rhodes, but there are a lot of people on the ground and a lot of people that are very, very interested, particularly in Morocco, that are interested in getting this thing done. And I hope to see each and every one of you at some point in the next 2 to 3 years. Thank you.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, and to give all of our participants who've waited in line an opportunity to offer their comments or questions, I just want to go to the remaining people who are in line, and if you could try to get your question or comment out there in 30 seconds to a minute, and then we'll have an opportunity for our panelists to have closing remarks. So I'm going to start again over here on the left.
Thank you. My name is Louis Lisa. I work with an organization called World Disaster Management. I first want to thank the panelists for their statements, and I'm reaching down to Mr. Diaz. I'm waiting to see your book on Lumumba. In '72, I sat over in Limba, trying to make my way up to Bolobo and looking for the road that USAID said they had spent money building. So your book should tell me where all that money went. Nonetheless, my question to you, to both the panelists, is whether or not you can explain to us whether or not you think the U.S. can take any role in working with France and England and Belgium and the other countries who have spent all their time destabilizing the countries by adding to the military issues and things of that nature that keep some of these presidents in power. The situation in Brazzaville I was very much involved in over the last year and a half. And one of the candidates who I'm very close with is still under house arrest in Brazzaville because he didn't make it. They changed the Constitution. But it has a lot to do with what we as a nation, the United States, who has a lot of clout and power, seems to do or not do. And so I thank, Ambassador Sullivan for her work and everything and trying to make it work. The idea of democratization in Africa hasn't taken place. We're working hard in the Far East. We're talking about, governments, but we have to take a role. And I'm wondering whether or not you think we can do anything with our European partners.
All right, thank you. And over here.
Yes, my name is Uwera Mary, and I represent an organization called Watch Democracy Grow. Mine are just like remarks. We tend to say, what is US doing, or US is doing this. But I think as a community, especially Africans, we really ought to own it. Democracy is a principle that it's tricky. Yes, you can vote, but if the population is not well empowered, informed to fight for their own values, it's so easy for leaders to manipulate. This is the case of Rwanda, or where I come from, by the way. Last year, it was so easy to change the constitution. Are we doing good? It was so easy to change the constitution because the population itself.
It works.
Yes, it's fine.
It's not. You can hear.
Yes.
Now we do. Okay, the population itself wasn't empowered to really be able to stand against the president to change the constitution. So how are we going to empower the community so that they can be able to stand on their own, to be able to advocate? Otherwise, US is not going to go in Kigali and says, hey, Mr. President, you really need to step down when the population is really supporting it. That is a challenge, really. We should know that US can do much, but as a community, how are we really going to be able to stand on our own? And that is so easy because if we are in Kamisa said, peace does not come from God. True, it doesn't. It comes from good leaders, strong institutions, and people who are in to fight for each other. If those ones in Kigali are saying, oh, well, today we have our bread, what about those ones who are suffering? Can we come to a common understanding that each and everybody of us, like leaders, we should put their leaders who are really going to be for the people and coming by the people and really to serve the people.
Okay, thank
that
you.
is my
Thank
second.
you. In the interest of being for each other and allowing each other to have time, I'm going to go over here to the left. Thank you.
I'll keep it brief. So my name is Mamadou. I'm a graduate student at Institute of World Politics. Can you hear me? Okay. So my question relates to the preparation of elections in Africa. In recent years, we've seen elections being postponed or being called rigged. So I'm happy that the AU is sending observers to countries, but why aren't we more proactive in ensuring that countries that have upcoming elections have the proper funds to hold elections? So my recommendation for the next administration is to work with the AU, regional organizations, and civil societies in those countries to make sure we have proper elections that are not postponed or rigged. So thank you.
Thank you. And over here.
Yeah, thank you. My name again is Ambassador Tunde Adetunji. I have the opportunity to have worked with the African Union closely, right away from the time of President Umar Konare of Mali. Yes, I like the presentation you made on Professor Jega, and what I propose for the African Union, Africa solutions to Africa problem. If Nigeria is good in democracy, why don't you enable that to be the electoral officer in Congo? If South Africa is good in technology, why don't you bring him, the guru, to be the technology man in Senegal? You see, what we are looking and what we are playing with is that the Anglophone, the Francophone, the Lusophone, the German, the Italian effect is still happening in Africa. On transportation, Ethiopia is the only country that can boast of adequate transportation. They maintain their aircraft, their pilot, but where is Air Afrique today? Where is Ghana Airways? Where is Nigerian Airways? They are all gone. The effect of the Anglophone, Francophone is totally has derailed it.
Thank
Now-
you very much. We're asking people to be very brief in their
Yes.
comments because
The
we're
last
coming to
question-
an end, and we have to, in the spirit of democracy, let our fellow
Just
citizens
one point,
speak.
because Isaac
And-
came in here.
And my dear brother, you have spoken in each session today, and I think you've used your allotment of time. Yes to the sister over here.
Hi, my name is Bora Impinja. I'm from Congo, and I just wanted to ask the professor a quick question. You had mentioned that you would have liked Obama to go to Congo, and I agree because of the ongoing conflict. And you said you wanted him to go to Congo and ask Kabila to step down. But I'm wondering if, what difference do you think it would make? Because it seems as if the United States, they always back leaders like Kabila. So if he steps down, I feel as if they're going to want somebody else who's just like him, who just serves the interest of the U.S. So I just wonder, how do you think that would help the Congolese when people like Kabila, Kagame, the president of Uganda, they get invited to the White House? And as far as I'm concerned, they should all be in prison for what they've done to Congo. So, I mean, even when if he does step down, if the Congolese are not allowed to have a say-so over who's elected, then how do you think it's going to help?
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Yes.
I have a quick comment. I'm a French speaker. Every time I come to those sessions, we always speak about English-speaking countries. So what about French-speaking countries? The other point is that some people were saying today, yes, what can the diaspora do and not do? And I was offended because Africans are not taking ownership of their problems. Every time we're here, we are just demanding. But what are we doing? We are doing nothing. We are just speaking. You have to excuse me. But this is not working. And the other, because what is happening is like, okay, the USA or France, you have to come to help us. And then at one point, it's our country, you cannot say anything. It's like nobody addressed the fact that our leadership is poor. We have to start there. And as educated people, we have to start thinking and getting organized before asking the US or France to come to our countries. We are not honest. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I believe we have one final question or comment from the floor. Well, you can just go to the line up behind him then. Go ahead, sir. No, he's passing. Okay, one final comment or question before I allow our panelists to have a closing remark.
Thank you. My name is Kobe Little. I've spent a lot of time in East Africa. I think it's important for African Americans to get to the table to address the return of the Berlin Conference. So I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to invite each of you who are interested in addressing these same issues and who think it's time for people of African descent to unite and talk about Africa for Africans to find me in this room before you leave. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to talking to you as well. Thank you, Congresswoman Bass, for this session.
Thank you very much. And I see the Congresswoman is joining us now. Do we have a moment to allow our panelists to have a final closing remark in responding to the last comments and questions from the floor? I'm going to turn to Vimba first.
Okay. All right, just quickly, a couple of things. Yes, when I say Obama needs to go to Congo, I don't mean literally Congo. All I mean is he needs to go. The U.S. has a tendency of looking for successful stories and success stories. It is a problem when you look for success stories because whatever you're calling success may not be success on the other side of it. So I think we need to look for stories that need, countries that need to be addressed, issues that need to be addressed. If people are being killed, you want to talk about gang and violence, you go to the hood. You address it from there. You don't go to a posh neighborhood and talk about gang violence. You should go where it is. So that's the point I was making. You know, when Ronald Reagan wanted to address issues of communism, he went to the Berlin Wall and made his statement there. Did the Berlin Wall fall that day? No. It took another several years. But what that does is some people can move the world. The President of the United States is one of those people, whether we like it or not. His words makes the market move. My words don't even make you move. right? So it's just a fact. So if we're going to use that power, we need to use it judiciously in a way that it makes sense, not go to places where we're hiding behind. If you're going to Senegal, you don't talk about democracy in Senegal. They don't need to hear it. That's what I'm saying. You're preaching to the choir, and we tend to do that. Ethiopia is definitely a problem, and you know that very quickly when you get to Ethiopia because even your phone doesn't work. So you cannot even tell your family that you've arrived safely. I bought local phone because my international roaming was not working. Even that doesn't work. That means state control. So it's a challenge to have the AU, when we talk about Pan-Africanism, to have its seat in a country that is doing everything against Pan-Africanism. That's why I don't believe in Pan-Africanism as it's defined. That's why I believe that people need to focus on each one in their house, in their country, put your house in order, and then one day we'll come together. It will come, but I just don't think we're there yet. The AU send observers. The observer rubber stamp everything that is wrong with that election. So that's how we end up with people who subvert term limits. They're still in power, and they have the blessing of the AU. I still believe, like we've heard so many times, change will come from Africa. I'm not under any illusion that change will come from here. But even this great nation was helped. We all know about Lafayette. We know about many people who came from outside to help the Americans in their fight. So the US can never say that the fight for independence was just done by Americans. No. So there's room for people to help others. But we need to help ourselves first and be under no illusion. So to me, I think, in a nutshell, that's it. We need to stick to principles and to the fundamentals. Everything else is blah, blah, blah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mbemba. And Kamisa,
Yeah.
your closing thoughts.
All right. So, le Mali, la Mauritanie, le Niger, le Burkina, le Tchad sont des pays d'une importance indéniable. And I don't think that nowadays we can talk about Africa by ignoring French-speaking countries. I don't think that this divide is was as much pronounced 10 years ago than. No, that's not what I want to say. It's not as much present today than it was 10 years ago, for example. So I don't think, well, for example, Mbemba and I are both native French speakers, so I think that there is definitely an importance of French-speaking countries here. African solutions to African problems. Wonderful. That's a quote that I think we should all hold dear to our hearts. However, in practice, it's quite different. I can tell you as an example, whatever happened in Mali in 2012, if the French were not there, I don't think that Mali would have existed today. We were not ready. The ECOWAS wasn't ready. The AU wasn't ready. The French just flew in 5 hours, and they took care of the problem for us. We did ask them to do it, but if they were not there, I don't think that we would have been able to deal with that. So I think we have to be very realistic about what we can do. African solutions to African problems is a long-term goal. We are working on it. It's going to take time. Again, I would like to make a plea to all of you. Civil society organizations are really the key there. The lady from Rwanda asked how do you empower people? How do you empower the population? I have no answer to that. There are indigenous efforts that are currently going on. People have to mobilize on their own, and that's actually part of the answer to African solutions to African problems. We are here in Washington, D.C., living the good life. They have to actually come together and decide this is what we want, this is what we don't want. From here in D.C., we're saying, well, Kagame wants to stay in power until 2070. Well, look, he's doing well. That's what we're seeing, and we're comparing him to an Ibeka in Mali or a Mahamadou Issoufou in Niger, and he's doing great. So unless the Rwandans come together and say, well, this is not what we want, we're still thinking that, everything's fine and the country's stable.
Well, thank you, Kamisa, for some provocative thoughts at the end there. I know Congresswoman Bass has some important words to share with you to close out this incredible day of the Africa Brain Trust. I've been privileged to participate in this event during CBC Week for many, many years, since it was first started by her predecessor. And I have to say that we continue to ask key questions, the right questions, and we continue to have the right debates. But we need to build our own resources here to continue this education and political struggle. We cannot just count on a member of Congress or a group of members of Congress or a administration. We have to hold our government accountable. We have to be able to articulate what kinds of policies will be more effective in solidarity with Africans working for democracy and security and inclusive governments. And we have to keep doing that good work. We know that Karen Bass is doing that good work on the Hill and throughout the arms and branches of government in her day-to-day work. And she pulls together this extraordinary event for us every year. And so I think in addition to saying thank you to our panelists right now, if we could also say thank you to Congresswoman Bass.
Thank you very much. I do have to admit that I have the easy part of the job. It's my staff that does the day-to-day and that pulls all of this together, and then they just invite me up to help facilitate. So I think we need to give a round of applause to the Capitol and District staff. Well, I want to thank everyone for attending this year's Brain Trust. And before I finish with a few concluding words, I see Ms. Culture sitting there. I have to ask you to stand up so I can finish reading the banner on you. Miss Culture USA 2016. Where are you from? Oh, well, congratulations. She's originally from the Congo. Thank you. Thank you for coming. I couldn't stand here and see that and not ask her to introduce herself. So I do want to thank you for all of the participants and all of the panelists. We've had an extraordinary day, and I think, you in helping us to set the agenda for the next administration, we have had staff in here taking copious notes from every single panel so that we really will take your information. And I appreciate you, Mr. Booker, saying that it's not about one member of Congress or even a bunch of members of Congress. We have to do this together. There's a strategy to work with members of Congress. That's the inside strategy, but it doesn't work unless the outside brings pressure. We're getting ready to bring in a new administration, and we need to make sure that Africa is high on the agenda. I'm confident that it is actually high on an agenda. I kind of laughed at what you were saying when you were talking about people that if you want to talk to Africans, you go to Africa. We do have somebody running for president that thinks he can talk to black people by talking to everybody but black people. So, we do have some bad examples here that we don't want to follow. But given the other person who I know that Africa is very much in her heart and has been on her agenda and was when she was Secretary of State and First Lady, I feel confident that it will be high on the next administration's list. But we have to make sure that it is. As president, you're sworn in and you have to deal with the entire planet. And so we have to make sure that this part of the planet actually raises in significance. The world is absolutely outraged if there's a terrorist act in France, but all of us know that Boko Haram killed more people than ISIS did last year. And when people think of Boko Haram, everybody knows of the girls, fortunately. But what everybody doesn't realize is all of the other people that were not just kidnapped, but massacred. And as previous panels have said, we tend to only know about the negative of Africa. But I compare that to the inner city, because it's the same way my community is characterized. South Central Los Angeles, everybody knows the Crips and the Bloods. When you think of South Central Los Angeles, that's what you think of. You don't think about families and single family homes and professionals and everybody else that's there. So whenever I think of how the press covers Africa, it's to me very similar to what happens here. Kamisa, I appreciate you talking about Francophone Africa. And you should know that we've been criticized, and I appreciate criticism because that helps you improve. And that's why we want you to fill out your evaluation forms. So please, if you have those forms, fill them out. But we've been criticized because when we do Africa policy breakfasts, we do not include oftentimes Francophone countries. And so I need to ask for your help in how to do that, especially with the language barrier, because it's very difficult to have events where you're having to do simultaneous translation. And so we experimented this morning, my chief of staff thought that up, was to have the translation be like you're reading a teleprompter. And I'd like to know from your feedback if you thought that that was, for those of you that were here this morning, if you thought that that was a positive thing to do. But I do need your input, and what should we do and how should we approach it? So thank you very much. I think this has been an amazing day. I know there's many, many other workshops and events to attend in the annual legislative conference. And let me just end by reminding you of what our slogan is this year, which is defining the moment and building the movement. We have certainly defined the moment here. Now we have to go out and build the movement. Thank you very much.